I'm excited to get started with session 1, Thinking Adaptively. So what does strategic mean to you? What's the best decision that you think that you've made in your career professionally over the last year? For me, it was starting a private practice to serve more leaders. What's the best decision that you've made in the last year personally? For me, it was giving up the hour-and-a-half commute a day and reinvesting that time to having some more centering practices where I can really do some deep thinking and also a re-engagement with personal fitness. And what does strategic mean to you? It means different things to different people. For me, it means not just choosing the easiest or the most obvious path, but the one that will have the biggest impact by taking advantage of existing resources and leveraging new opportunities. And what's the value of being strategic? For me, it means knowing that I used the resources that I had well, and that I'm moving the dial on something really important that has significance on impacting other people's lives and on their health. So that's what strategic means for me. I'd like for you to do some reflection and thinking on what that might mean for you. What if everyone that you work with, that you serve on your teams and in your staff, can do extraordinary work, right? What if everyone can be a strategic decision maker? And what if every leader can cultivate an environment where everyone is making strategic decisions? What would that look like? What would that feel like? I think it would feel really great. Cultivating a cultural norm around thinking strategically can open up opportunities for the challenges that you're trying to solve. But it can also bring about a personal satisfaction and fulfillment with work among your team members and among your staff towards those collective goals. So it has sort of that side benefit as well. So this is an opportunity to kind of step back, look at everything that you do and think, what if maybe there's a slightly different way we can do this so that everyone's feeling that they're contributing in a strategic way. Think about a challenge in your state related to your nutrition work, and think about what's the change that you can dream of. What is that change that you imagine that's in your dreams, maybe even in your awake dreams or your nighttime dreams, that could really help the nutrition of the maternal child health population that you serve? What's that thing that could move the dial? Give some thought to that, because I'm going to want you to reflect on it throughout the rest of our trainings or the mini sessions. And just give some thought as to what would that one thing really be that could really change things and that I would just absolutely love to see happen. And try to forget all restrictions and barriers that might currently be prohibiting you from doing those sort of things, and stop thinking about all the reasons why this isn't possible. Kind of quiet that voice in your mind if you can, and go back to the what if that was on the last slide. For maternal child health nutrition, what would really move the dial in your context? And just keep that in the back of your mind as we keep moving. So most social problems are complex, right? And a lot of times we have multiple concurrent changes affecting each other in complex ways. And when we're facing challenges like this, we often feel some sort of urgency to do something. And this all points to adaptive challenges, right? When it's messy, when it's hard, when it's complex, when it's layered, but we know it's really important. So adaptive leadership, we know we're doing adaptive work when there's more than one answer. There's more than one way to approach the problem. And it's not super clear how to do it or what to choose to focus on. It looks a little bit messy, right? One maternal child health team that I worked with wanted to take 3 different care coordination models and create one singular one. Now, for anyone in public health, that might not sound like a huge endeavor, but if you know what I'm talking about, which many of you do, that is a massive undertaking across an entire state agency so that the work is consistently shifted to one model all the way down to the local partner, engaging with all the community resources and community partners on the local level. It was a huge undertaking, right? And they could have designed that one singular model probably 1,000 different ways. So they had to go through a really careful planning process to make sure that the one that they chose, the path that they picked, really was going to be the one that would make the best difference for their goals. So that's a good example. So whenever you think of the term adaptive leadership, it's important to remember that change looks different, depending on where you sit, where your position is. And I love this image. My friend Christina Welter, who I mentioned earlier, turned me on to this sort of analogy of thinking about a climbing structure that we see children climbing on at our local parks. And, the kids are in all these different positions and they see the down below where their parents are and their caregivers are very differently, depending on where they are positioned, right? And so it's a great analogy for us to think about because adaptive challenges are the exact same way. We're seeing this right now with the coronavirus pandemic, particularly around equity issues. So, for example, there's certain people that can work from home, but then there's certain people that have to work outside of the home. They don't have a choice. There's some families that have easy access to technology, and then there's others that don't. There's some people that have job security through the pandemic, and then there's others, if they don't show up to work physically, or maybe the job has furloughed or it's changed or it's on pause or it's canceled, then they don't get paid, right? And of course, there's the constant issue we have around health insurance. Some of us have it and some don't. And then childcare is another consideration. So everyone's experiencing the same coronavirus pandemic across the world, but depending on where you are, which country you're in, which region of the country, which state of the country, and then even on the local level, there's lots of variations depending on personal circumstances. It looks and feels very, very different. The risk factors are very, very different. And that's why we're seeing minority populations dying from coronavirus and having higher incidence and prevalence rates. So this is exactly what we're talking about in terms of an adaptive challenge. To think adaptively, we have to seek new information from expected and unexpected sources. So and all the examples I can think of all the agencies I've worked with who have done tremendous, huge, large-scale role transformation work for their agencies, huge adaptive challenges, the number one thing that comes to my mind is the first thing they did was leave their building. And they started knocking on doors in other sectors. They started, having town hall meetings with community residents that didn't typically engage with their agency. And they went out and did listening sessions. They attended conferences they had never been to in different sectors, hearing different voices, different perspectives. I can tell you so many great examples. And it was really fascinating to me to listen to all of the things they were learning about their own communities. That's probably the biggest thing to do first, is just get out there and really listen to different perspectives. Now, you might have a short list of people you have to go seek their perspectives, but then you might not, you want to go out and get the ones that you don't actually know, that where you ask people, who else should I talk to about this? Who else should I be listening to? And this is so important. Why? Because to work adaptively means we have to work differently. That's exactly what it means. It means we have to work differently. So we just need to learn how we can adjust our own ways of doing things. So we need to get more perspectives and more ideas of how it would work for different people. So these are all helpful books by Heifetz to help us think in ways that push us outside our comfort zones. They all encourage us not to settle for that easy path, but to push beyond and hone our own abilities to be flexible. And let go of the shortcuts that our brains often use every time we find a challenge. We call those mental models. You've probably heard that phrase before. It might be something you're already familiar with. But and for anyone who's not, mental models just means, we would be exhausted all the time if we faced every single challenge without historical reference material in our memories to help us know how to approach something, right? When my kid falls on the ground, I don't have to think through absolutely every little step of what to do. I know just automatically what to do because I've had a lot of experience with that, because I have 3 sons, so I have a lot of experience with kids falling and bruising their knees. So is that sort of an example? It's like with driving, right? We face a lot of similar challenges when we're driving, but we wouldn't have enough reaction time if we had to go from ground zero to solution each time. We have these automatic ways set up in our brains already, these faster pathways neurologically that help us kind of get to that problem solving place really fast. So that's what that means. We have to actually let go of our mental models when we're doing adaptive work, and we have to kind of force ourselves to kind of go back to that earlier stage of like not knowing where to go or what to do. So in order to imagine a different future state, we have to first consider how we can be more self-aware of our own tendencies and how we often fall into old habits. So developing that self-awareness is a really great beginning step. And this goes both for individuals and teams, because teams have their own dynamics of how they fall into the same patterns. And so when you're thinking about leading and working with your teams, you want to kind of shake things up a little bit and not follow the exact same patterns of engagement with them, because you'll get oftentimes the same results. So we have to catch ourselves reverting into old patterns of decision making that led us to the same approaches. Instead, we need to intentionally encourage ourselves to explore the unknown, the what if, the possibilities if we go in a different direction. I'm thinking about a team I've worked with who has worked with the criminal justice sector, and this was a few years ago, and really had to just get outside of the office and knock on doors and ask a lot of questions of leaders in their community that they had never really engaged with before. And they discovered that there was, a lack of some aligned and coordinated communication systems between all the different touch points of the criminal justice and social services sectors. And so before they could go forward with this great big wonderful solution-based idea that they thought they had, they first had to address that, and setting up that foundation of a better information exchange structure and communication structure really set the entire initiative up for great success. So why is this adaptive leadership work so hard? We show this slide a lot because we find that a lot of people that we work with and that we talk to, and most people are kind of on that far side of the square, kind of in their own box, kind of doing things the same way, thinking the same way, approaching problems in the same way. And the reason we do that is because we as humans have commitments, conscious and unconscious, but a lot of unconscious ones that we're feeding all of the time, and we hold on to those. We might be worried to put a new idea out there, for example, because we know if we put it out there, it might mean a loss in some way for ourselves as individuals or a team or our organization. So things like, people get anxious about things like role identity. If I put this idea out here, it might change my role, it might change the role of my staff, it might change the role of our organization. And that brings up a lot of feelings for folks. And then if you happen to be someone who's a bit on the side of risk adverse, it can bring up a lot of feelings when you're trying to put forth a new idea or listening to a new idea, because you're thinking through all the ways that it might increase risk, and that might be an uncomfortable spot for you. And it also, you might have like a limited resources mentality, thinking we only have so many resources, so we can't even entertain that idea because it doesn't fit into our current funding structure, rather than really hearing it out and really giving it some valid consideration and rethinking the funding structure as a second step. But going to a quick, no, that's not going to work given our current circumstances. So those are some of our natural human tendencies. We all do all of them. But you want to kind of catch yourself and say, wait a minute. Let's give this some thought. This might be the thing that could change things, and we can worry about the rest as we go. So what happens when we get out there and we get some perspectives on our problem? So the more comfortable that we get in having conversations that are motivated by curiosity, I'm going to talk about that a lot, curiosity. It's funny how opportunities and new paths suddenly emerge, and it's almost magical. I've really enjoyed watching leaders who, as they've kind of grappled with and gone through some difficult processes, as they've pushed through and really kept pushing others to think differently or consider possibilities, new opportunities for funding, new opportunities for resources, for staffing, for partnership, for agreements that they didn't think, and partnerships they didn't think were possible have been created. So it is possible, and it's a little bit of a mental shift, a little bit of a mindset shift. So when you get really good at this, then you can start to ask others to consider seeing their problems from a whole new light. And that's where the leadership piece comes in, right? It's not just figuring this out yourself, but it is encouraging others to embrace this way of thinking as well, and starting to ask them questions about, well, what might happen in really mastering those sort of curiosity questions. People will try to wriggle out of adapting. I'm giggling a little bit because we do a lot of workshops and exercises, and we'll watch people try to squirm their way out of having to actually complete an exercise around thinking adaptively or changing their mindset to something more adaptive, because it's really hard, because it's easier to find that technical fix, right? So and why is that? It's because the technical fixes have less conflict. And even if we know that the technical fix won't really address the larger issue at hand or the underlying problem, it's oftentimes where we focus our resources and our dollars and all our downstream efforts. Like, just one example off the top of my mind is if you're trying to, if you've got a community where there's high teen pregnancy rates, for example, the technical fix is making sure that they have the family planning resources available to them, right? But at the same time, if you do more investigation and ask a lot of questions, and you find out that a lot of those teenage mothers were actually wanting to feel like they had someone to love them, and they wanted to feel like they had an important role in their community, and there was enough of the other teenage moms to make them feel like that was a really nice, close-knit community that they wanted to be part of, and that was a part of their motivation, then just providing them with contraception isn't going to necessarily deal with the teenage pregnancy issue at hand. It's going to take a much more adaptive approach to help them address some of the underlying causes of their motivations. So that's just one very quick example, but it's a lot easier. And I don't mean it's easy to put out a program like that with comprehensive family planning, etc. But we know what to do. There's models out there. We kind of know how to do that. We don't have to go and kind of create that from scratch. But the other hand, the underlying issues are going to be a lot more complex. And we're going to have to pull from a lot of different angles and a lot of different models and a lot of different perspectives in order to come up with a solution that might work. And we're going to have to test it, and then we're going to have to evaluate it, and then we're going to have to tweak it, right? So it's going to be a lot of back and forth. So why do we hate conflict so much? I don't actually know the answer to that question. It's something I wonder about a lot, because I talk about change a lot, and people tell me in a big room, well, I don't like change. And I'm like, okay. I've even had people tell me I don't do change. And I'm wondering, as you move forward in some of this kind of work, that you might face some of that initial kind of resistance as well. So I think there's a lot written out there about why people don't like change. There's a lot of research and so on and so forth. But in my gut, I think it's because most of us get into the business of serving others in public health, for example, because we like that feeling of helping. And that's great. And that's wonderful. I know that's why I got into this field, and probably you did too. And even though that we know that conflict will push the boundaries and eventually lead towards better, more sustainable results, the immediacy of how that kind of works just kind of leaves feeling the limits of our own participation, So like I said, I just don't really know. I just know that most people in a crowded room will raise their hand when I say, how many of you dislike conflict? So I think it's just about kind of getting people comfortable with the idea of the possibility, and just kind of holding space for that, and holding an opportunity to discuss that. So here's a little chart that I think is really helpful as we think about the differences between technical challenges and adaptive challenges. And when we talk about upstream and downstream, you'll see that there's a little bit of a relation with them as well. So technical challenges are usually easy to identify. They have quick and easy solutions. And I use the term easy loosely, because it's not easy to run, for example, a well-established community-based farmers market program on the weekends. It's not easy to pull that off, but we know how to do it, is kind of what they mean by easy here. It requires small changes within our known boundaries, and it can usually be solved by an expert. We call that phoning it in. You can call somebody, hey, how did you do this? And they can tell you how. And the solutions can usually be implemented pretty quickly. Adaptive challenges, on the other hand, are really hard to even identify. to figure out what it is you want to work on collectively. That is a whole body of work in and of itself. And it requires changes in values, beliefs, and the approaches that you and others have to their work. So that's why it brings up some of those feelings that we talked about earlier, particularly around role identity and risk aversion and things like that. It requires a lot of changes across a lot of different, sometimes unknown boundaries. So there's the unknown piece of it, and then there's the multiplier effect of lots of little changes over time, over different boundaries. So it's more complicated. It's solved by the people who actually have the problem. It's not coming up with just like, what do we think is the best idea, but it's getting out there and really, really listening to the end user and to the influencers of those end users to figure out what the potential solutions might be. And there's no quick fixes, and it needs a whole lot of experimentation, which just means a lot of process evaluation, right? How is this working? How can this be improved as you're going along? It's an applied process. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples, see if you can kind of figure out which is which. So I'm going to give you two questions, and you've got to think about which is the adaptive one and which is the technical. So the first one is, how will we staff the summer lunch program for kids experiencing food insecurity? Versus, how will we ensure kids don't go hungry this summer? So you've probably figured out that the adaptive question is the second one, because it doesn't make any assumptions about which intervention we're going to use, right? It's asking the broader, bigger question, and it allows for lots of different possible solutions. So that's the answer on that one, if that helps. And here's the next one. How can we bring pop-up farmer markets to food desert areas? Versus, how can we eliminate food deserts? So this is very similar to the first one. The second one is the adaptive question. And I often say, when we put a group of public health professionals in a room together around a table, and we put the problem in the middle of the table, or in our case, oftentimes up on the flip chart or the whiteboard, what's the first thing that people do? They brainstorm solutions, right? But there's actually like a whole longer process that helps you frame the question first and correctly, that will allow for lots of different solutions. So if you jump too quickly into solution generation, you're only using the perspectives of those people in that room, and that's a little bit limiting. And you might not even be focused on the right question that's going to have the biggest impact for the real problem that you're most concerned with. So this is a good example of that. How can we eliminate food deserts versus how can we effectively address poverty? So this is a little bit of a trick one, because they're both adaptive questions. But if I had pressed you and asked you which one is the more adaptive one, you probably would think it's how do we effectively address poverty? And as nutrition professionals, you know that poverty has a direct link to the nutrition outcomes of your population. But sometimes our funding sources and the way our programs are designed and the way we talk about our work is focused more on some of the downstream programs and services and interventions around nutrition solutions versus instead of the larger, more upstream issues around poverty, which are a lot more harder and more complex to solve. And so there you go. So this is an image I use a lot and my colleagues use a lot. It comes from a great book called Immunity to Change that I enjoy. And it talks about this concept of leadership levels. And I find it really interesting because I do work with leaders that are at different levels, and I see kind of what happens as they jump from one to the next, or as they evolve from one to the next, and what the complexities and the challenges are. So my point in bringing this up for you today is just to say that it's a lot easier to stay in that technical domain in the first two levels of leadership. But as you advance more to that third level, which I believe a lot of you are already in that third level, if you're not able to adapt the adaptive leadership skills, you might experience a lot of struggles. And you might experience a lot of struggles even if you have, because the nature of adaptive work is that there's going to be conflict. That is the norm. I can't tell you how often my phone rings and I have someone who thinks that they're in crisis. And I do have some that are truly in crisis, but sometimes people will call and think that they're in crisis. And then it's just a matter of myself or my colleagues kind of providing some reassurance that this is just the norm of the level of leadership that you are in right now. And there's strategies we can give you, there's supports we can give you for how to navigate it so that you feel like you're doing the best job that you can and you're feeling personal fulfillment in your work. But I do think it does help a little bit just to know that that is part of the norm of doing leadership work at that level. So when we talk about adaptive leadership a lot, you may have heard this analogy of the dance floor and the balcony. So what happens to adaptive leaders, particularly at that third level of leadership, is they have to constantly juggle the two. They have to be down in the weeds, as we say, of the operational details of how programs and services and planning work and partnership work and everything else gets done, right? But then there's this other whole scope of work of getting up higher and seeing the big picture and guiding strategy and helping your staff and your teams and your partners all move towards those larger kind of North Star issues. And that's the challenge. I've worked with a leader who had a new exciting story to tell me each time I spoke with her about the latest emergency that she had to drop everything for. And then she was trying to reorganize her entire agency towards some new strategic goals that were focused on prevention and focused on more upstream solutions. But she kept getting pulled into the dance floor issues of emergencies. And so we had to put some supports in place so that she could better navigate this balance together. So if you ever feel like you're getting kind of pulled in two directions a little bit too much, or maybe you feel like you're pulled into the details too much and you're struggling to find time and space and thinking mental space to do that important strategic work, know that there are ways that you can carve out time, put some limitations and some protections in place to safeguard your time and your physical space so that you can do that important work. I oftentimes think that's why a lot of leadership retreats ask me to come and do an off-site retreat, right? They have to get away from all of that in order to do that big thinking work, right? You've all probably participated in those. So balcony work is more than just kind of having that bigger view or that bigger perspective. It's also about kind of, like I just said, figuring out what works for you and what works for your teams consistently to find time and space to do that important work. I know for me, it's in the morning. I'm way better in the morning. And like I said, it's oftentimes for groups they want to get off site, or they have a particular time of week where they can dedicate to this kind of work. But it's really important to just be thoughtful and conscious about it. So how do you lead from an adaptive mindset? So when I'm helping people, I'm trying to help them see that the organizational culture itself is adapting. There's like a complex dynamic change process already underway that they are trying to kind of layer onto, right? So a lot of you already have these kind of changes already happening, but you want to kind of see what makes the most sense, what's going to have the biggest impact. And we're going to talk about some tools later that can help you do that. Know that when you do have change work coming up, it also means for a lot of folks some negative feelings like loss, danger, anxiety, giving up cherished ways of believing, maybe giving up tools that they really like using, or working in certain places or with certain people. So the giving things up that they've already been very vested into can feel a little bit jarring for a lot of folks. And like we said earlier, people will try to wriggle out of adapting because it's easier to find that technical fix because there's less conflict. And even if we know that that won't actually get to that underlying cause. So the ability to get a group into a problem-solving idea generation mode and keep them there over time is really key. And you know, there's a lot of tools out there. I think Six Hats is actually kind of a decent one for doing that. because you can say, well, we're not going to work on coming up with solutions just yet. We're still here thinking through the ideas, or we're still here thinking through who the who is. And so, you can kind of structure your facilitation of a group process in such a way where you can hold people in that adaptive mindset space. And then if they get kind of too into the, it's not going to work because of this, it's not going to work into that in later stages, you can always bring the group back to an earlier stage of exploring ideas and kind of bring them back to that big picture thinking as much as you need to. So I have a note here that says leading is dangerous and don't act like it isn't. And that's what I mean about leaders oftentimes are struggling because they're cooking the conflict. They're dealing with the conflict that the adaptive change or the possibility of adaptive change has created. And so you just want to be very aware of your own emotions and how you are projecting how you're thinking and feeling, and being transparent and being honest and authentic, but also not being reactive or being put onto the defensive as people are coping with and thinking about and embracing and engaging with the idea of possible change. So you want to stay strong and know where to go and what to do to recharge your own batteries and to get yourself to that place where you feel renewed on a daily basis. So I went to this wonderful workshop last year. It was part of one of the leadership convenings that we did with our leaders. And I made a promise to myself that every single training that I do for the next year, at least, I'm going to try to incorporate at least one thing I learned from this workshop, because it was really transformative to me. It was led by Trabian Shorters from the BME movement. Where he's doing an amazing work in the United States with Black men, and it's a movement to try to shift the narrative that is so overly negative towards Black men, and it's unnecessarily so. And he does a wonderful job of articulating how things are exaggerated and myths are perpetuated, and it was really a wonderful, wonderful workshop. And I went into it thinking that I already knew a lot about assets-based framing. And I came out of it thinking I knew nothing about assets-based framing. I thought I had been doing a decent job of assets-based framing throughout my career. And then I had this realization that no, in fact, I had a lot farther to go. And so every opportunity I've had, I've brought this concept up with wonderful feedback from the groups I've worked with. So I wanted to share just a really quick thought with you all as you're thinking about framing your adaptive challenges, and as you're thinking about framing the change work that you either want to do now or do in the future. I want you to remember this concept of assets-based framing, and he has a wonderful set of videos. You can just Google his name up on the internet and like YouTube. But it's this concept of, you actually can get more funding. You can actually achieve all the things you want to achieve by doing this shift. I think we sometimes think that we have to use the language of our funders to get the funds that we need to do what we do. So he put up this like wordle that I have here. He put this up on a slide, something like this on a slide, and said, I want you to all write your huge transformations that you're trying to do in your agencies and in your communities, and you can't use any of these words. And I think he even had more words, like it was a really long list. And his point is, you cannot talk about populations that we serve in these negative frames of being impoverished or at risk or all these negative terms, because that objectifies them. Instead, what he asks us to do is to write about their aspirations, that population's aspirations. So for example, if you're talking about teenagers who are at risk, instead you would talk about these hardworking teenagers that go to school and, hold second jobs where they are able to provide financial contributions to the family budget and help provide food for their siblings. And they're ingenious and creative and all these wonderful things. And they have big goals. And they would like to pursue a college education. So you talk about their aspirations before you then describe their context. And it's a different way of expressing. And I just think it's so important. And the more I can kind of spread that to others, I think the collective gain will be tremendous. So what are some adaptive actions that you think that you can take to learn more about your challenge. And notice the word there is learn, right? What are some actions that you think you can do to get out there and get those new perspectives or different perspectives? Think really out of the box here. And connected to that, how can you be more aware of certain beliefs that might be limiting you? I hope that this has triggered some questions around that, because we all have limiting beliefs. So it's a matter of just being aware of them. Was I feeling limited by existing, funding opportunities, for example, or was I limited by how I think a certain partner relationship would play out if we came together around X issue? Ask yourself those sort of questions. And just jot down on your handout, how do you think you can go out and get more perspectives? Because if the more thought you put into that, the better, I think. So coming back to that concept of what is possible, I think when you're engaging with adaptive leadership work, you really can find ways for everyone to do extraordinary work, and everyone can become a strategic thinker. And every leader can work with their team to cultivate an environment where everyone's thinking strategically. It's just a matter of facilitating those opportunities to work differently and approach things a little bit differently. And we're going to get into the how to do that next in our next session. So thanks so much.